Hello YouTube, my name is Ryan Thomas and this is the DM Genesis program. Before I start, I'd like to mention two things. One of them, as you know, I'm trying to keep things a little bit shorter than I have been in the past. However, this is a rather information-heavy episode. So, I'm going to maintain my 15-minute limit on my videos. However, I'll probably make 2 installments for this particular episode. As I said, it is rather information-heavy. I will get into that in more detail later. The second thing, I must apologize for those of you who have complained at the lack of graphical representation in my videos. I don't exactly have many capabilities when it comes to graphical representation because, as you saw, holding paper up to the screen wasn't particularly effective. Even then, it really would only work with maps and such. With the notes I have currently sitting in front of me, there's not much point to showing them to you. I did try for a short time to make a PowerPoint and use the Manycam program I found online to cut to that screen to show you the PowerPoint. But it didn't work that well because I don't have the $50 to buy Manycam. I could only try the trial. And that has a large blinking watermark at the bottom of it, which didn't look too good. Then I had some problems with the program in general. As a result, my lighting is off. As a result, I chose not to use the program, and I can't fix the lighting, and that's frustrating. Close enough. So, that said, I'm going to move on to the episode itself, which is Episode 4, Encounter I Hardly Knew Her. And yes, the titles are going to get worse as the series progresses. So, now, this episode is in response to someone asking me, how do you balance a party? In more detail, for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept at all for some reason, this means, how do I make a combat, or any encounter, an issue I'll bring up in a moment, such that the party meets a challenge, has fun with it, and does not die screaming like little girls on the ground. Personally, I've had a problem with this in the past. My campaigns are rather harsh, and I have a pretty high death toll, something I'm proud of. I'm sorry. However, I'll try to be more fair to you guys. So, now, I'm going to start by saying there are 3 main kinds of combat. There are 3 main kinds of encounters. Combat is only one of them. The other 2 are social encounters and puzzle encounters. Combat encounters are probably the most common, the easiest to make, and require the most numerical input, for obvious reasons. So, that said, I'm going to start on combat. This is a 2-part episode because this is a rather lengthy subject. You can feel free to watch one of the episodes or both. This part of the episode, part 1, will have, as the other one does, a 15-minute time limit. This one will probably reach time limit and will be centered completely around combat. The second episode, the second video, will be based on social encounters and puzzle encounters and will probably not reach the 15-minute maximum. So, depending on what you're looking for, feel free to watch this video or go and watch the next one, or watch both. I will be grateful either way. Now, starting with combat. So, in fact, I don't know of any systems that don't. All systems, I assume, have a method built into them that allows you to balance combat strictly on a numerical basis for your party. Now, Pathfinder, I will use as an example here because I am more familiar with it, has something called a CR, which is a challenge rating, which is essentially the level for your encounter, typically a bestiary creature. Let's say our ogre is CR5 for some reason. I think that's rather low, but I could be wrong. I just can't tell off the top of my head. It also has an APL, it being Pathfinder. APL is short for average party level, which is essentially the party level, or the rough numerical approximation for the competence of your party. If you heard that statement, you're probably already seeing why there's a bit of a disconnect here, because in a game where imagination is king, numbers, while they are very general and can apply to many people, which is why they have to exist in these rulebooks, often can be rather inaccurate. And this is pretty much the only situation where numbers are inaccurate, because let's face it, math is king in the world. End of story. That's how the world works. So, lighting. Crud. So, I'm totally thrown off now. Yes. I'm not going to go into detail about how to balance combats on a numerical basis, for the reason that all of your rulebooks probably already have a way to do that. In fact, I mentioned the CR and the APL. It's all stuff done by Pathfinder already. your version probably has something along those lines. So be aware of that when you're making your combats. However, there are cases where those numbers do not work, as I mentioned earlier. For example, let's say my average party level 4 party, in this case, is made of a rogue, a wizard, a cleric, and a paladin. That's a pretty balanced party, pretty strong in combat. They can go up pretty easily against a CR4 or CR5 encounter made of monsters. However, there are some cases where, for some reason, your average party level 4 party goes up against a CR3 creature and gets absolutely face-rolled. It's not pretty. Let's say, for example, your party is for some reason made up entirely of bards. The numbers in the system say that your party is APL 4, because they're all level 4 and the average works out that they're 4. But a group of 4 bards really does not have the combat proficiency to fight a encounter made for CR4 or CR5 by CR4 or CR5 creatures. So you can see why there's a bit of a discrepancy here. It's all very subjective. Your party can change things, the items your party has can change things, the amount of teamwork your party uses can change things. So what I'm going to give you here are general tips and tricks on how to work around the occasional inaccuracy in the numerical system. So I'll get right on that, and as I do so, I would like you to keep in mind, for the entirety of this section at least, there is something you need to be aware of as a DM, and that is your party's A, competence, and B, abilities. Because you, at the end of the day, are the only one who can truly balance an encounter for your party. In order to do this, you need to be familiar with your party's capabilities and how likely your party is to use them. So let's say you have a wizard who just really does not want to use his summoning spells, but summoning spells in Pathfinder at least are really good. You need to be aware of this, and you can't design a combat based on the fact that he's going to use his summoning spells. Obviously this is all, again, subjective, and it's something you need to be aware of as a DM, and I want you to consider that as this episode goes on. For now, I'm just going to give general stuff that ignores that and just say, keep that in mind. Eventually, you will be designing combats based solely upon how you know your party works. That's how I do it. I avoid CRs and everything except awarding experience where it becomes useful, because that's just numbers as well. And I build combats based on my party's abilities and capabilities to make sure that they get a challenge and fun out of it. So, I'm sorry. So, first off, I want you to be familiar with your party's items, because A, you gave them to them, so you should be familiar with them in general, and B, items can be pulled out when you don't expect them to and do some surprising things. I'm not going to bother with examples here, but just take my word for it. You should be aware of what your party has in terms of weaponry, armor, and even just miscellaneous items. I have had cases where just the oddest little miscellaneous item that my party got became extremely useful in combat, and I couldn't say no to it because it was a completely logical step for them to take this substance and use it in such a fashion. So you need to be aware of what they have for items. Don't stress too much about it, but just be aware, because you're never going to be able to fully guess what your party does, and winging it is always important as a DM. But just don't start handing out +3, +4 swords and losing track of giving them out completely, because next thing you know, the encounter you designed to fight your party with, it's not anywhere near strong enough because you've accidentally given them too much. Be aware of that. So, another thought is, until you are familiar with your group's capabilities, try using combat in waves. Imagine your party is fighting the town guard for some reason, and your party fights the first 2 town's guardsmen and they just absolutely destroy them. Don't even break a sweat. So this is problematic for you as a DM. Obviously the balancing wasn't perfect there, so how do you get past this? Well, before the second one dies, he pulls out a whistle, blows on the whistle, and more guards show up. This is combat in waves. It's a good way of... I use it actually first to measure my party's capabilities, but it's a good way of just kind of using backup in case you misjudge something. Let's say you design a combat such like that. You design a combat based on town guards like that, and you go, okay, so first wave is going to be normal town's guardsmen, the second wave is going to be royal guardsmen, which are much stronger, and the third wave will be, I don't know, archers guardsmen or something. Okay, so the first wave got owned way too easily, I really need to send that second wave in, so you send the second wave in. But then the second wave comes in and just starts absolutely destroying your party. Well, luckily you didn't tell them about the third wave, so you don't need to pull that third wave in. That's the usefulness of having waves. It really lets you build a combat based on your party's current status, and it makes combat very dynamic, which is very interesting. Now, that is considered an attritionary combat method. There is another kind, the all-in combat method as I call it, which is typically reserved for boss fights, which you do not have waves for. You just go in with everything at once, a very strong enemy. It's fairly straightforward. Be aware of the difference between attritionary combat and all-in combat, and use them appropriately. Attritionary will wear down the party. All-in should really push them and should really give them a run for their money. If you're really not sure what to do, you could also try building a combat around a specific mechanic. Imagine that the party is now fighting at the base of a volcano for some reason, and there are lava flows moving past, and from these lava flows, lava elementals keep rising up. Well, that's not a pretty sight, considering you don't know how many of them are going to rise up, so the party activates the orb that happened to be standing nearby, which will cause rivers of water to spurt out of the orb and cover the lava, which creates obsidian, which seals off the creation of fire elementals, from the lava. That's a mechanic that is built into the combat so that the combat can be manageable for the party. It's something that is sitting there, and it kind of gives them a little bit of a mental reward for feeling clever, for doing something that you weren't expecting, that as far as they know, you weren't expecting them to do. It's better than just swinging their swords and goes, oh, we must reach the orb, and they charge towards the orb, and all kinds of interesting stuff happens. You can see how that goes. So, along those lines, actually, mechanics in combat, you need to be aware that sometimes you screw up as a DM. And in certain fights, especially when as I said earlier, the all-in method, you want to build something into the fight that is kind of like an emergency button. If your party's in trouble, you don't want to just start behind the screen going, rolling, oh, he missed, when he actually rolled a 20. It would be much better if you say, let's say they were fighting in a cavern at the bottom of the volcano, and they were fighting this massive fire demon. So they can see some piles of bones over in the corner, and an oddly large pile of bones in one particular corner of the room. And the fight's looking bad for them because you kind of messed up a little bit when it came to balancing the fight. So they start getting desperate. Oh no, what do we do? What do we do? If they're clever, they'll go looking on their own. If they're not, or they just don't trust you, then they'll probably just freak out, and you might need to give them a hint. But either way, let's say that in the pile of bones, over to the very large pile of bones in the corner, you had buried a scroll. If this scroll is delivered to the wizard, he would be able to read it. Cast a spell from the scroll, and it is the scroll of, I'll just call it Quenching Earth. Yeah, that sucks. Stifling Earth is better. Okay. So, and when he casts this scroll, a large amount of dry soil will fall from the sky, or spurt forth from the scroll, whatever you want, and fire itself at the fire demon. And as you all know, you can stifle fire pretty well. I'm sorry. Bleh. You can stifle fire with earth, cutting off its oxygen supply, causing it to dwindle, meaning the fire elemental becomes significantly weaker, making combat much better for your party. And when the fire elemental becomes weaker, how weak it becomes, you don't need to tell the party straight off. So you can be like, oh, well, they're obviously in a lot of trouble, so I'll weaken it by a lot. Or they're only in a little bit of trouble, so I'll only weaken it by a little. It's something you can build based on how the things are going. So my time's kind of running out for this section. I'm going to do a really quick recap, and then we're going to move on to the next section. I hope to see you in the next video. So recap. 1. Be familiar with your party's items. 2. Consider using combat in waves. 3. If you're in trouble, build a combat completely around a certain mechanic that'll allow you to that'll act both as an emergency save button and as a wave stopper button or something like that. You get my point. And 4, build an emergency stop button into the system somewhere. It'll make your life easier. It'll make the party survive longer. So that's it for this section. What was that? I'll see you in a minute.